Yeah, this is Working Group Multi-Tenancy. And today on our agenda, we have Tasha talking about what they're working on at VMware.
Cool. Yeah. Hey, this is Tasha. And so basically what we have been talking about with some of our customers who are looking at how they want to adopt Kubernetes organizationally, so very large organization, and going to have many business units potentially sharing the same cluster, but wanting to have a multi-tenant cluster that has good container isolation within it. And so sort of picked that up and have started kind of researching all of the work that this working group has been doing over that, and looking at the various documents and watching some of the last conversations, which were really in-depth and good, and just kind of wanted to meet with the working group and see kind of where that was right now. Jess, I saw your doc that kind of went over like the individual permissions that we would look at, and that seemed really tight. And then kind of saw the other doc that had the various groupings of different types of multi-tenancy. The one that we're really interested in, and that I suspect a lot of people are really interested in, is that one organization that is semi-trusted. So you aren't expecting sort of anonymous users to come in and having to really lock everything down from that perspective, but still wanting to have good isolation between the different organizations that are sharing that multi-tenant cluster. So I just kind of wanted to kick off that conversation and see kind of where the group was and kind of where different people were coming from with regards to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think that model is more realistic in terms of actually getting it to work today. Like that should be possible. It's just in my opinion, I'm sure people might disagree. But I think it's more just no one's written the guide to doing it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Well, I think, we're happy to kick off a guide for sure, if that would be the right, first step, and then kind of iterate from there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be awesome because I've like heard a lot of people asking for things like that. And yeah, it's hard without like actually having the use case of the person doing it to do it accurately.
So, and this is Jared. I work here with Tasha, and we were thinking about this, and it felt like we were watching some of the previous conversations of this call where we were debating different forms of tenancy, of like what is a tenant. And so it seemed like it would be useful, like, first of all, to kind of maybe capture and formalize that notion of what we mean by that interdepartmental tenancy. So single organization, some degree of trust, but, the relationship of those teams, to sort of document that use case. And then second of all, to kind of document, there exist all these policy objects that we can configure in Kubernetes to achieve that level of isolation. And there's that guy that sort of lists them all out. But perhaps to go so far as to perhaps like define like a profile or a standard set of policy objects that would, based on the capabilities in Kubernetes today that implement that model.
Yeah, so there was the work that David had shown along with someone else from Google it was maybe months ago, about security kind of policies that you could apply to a cluster. So it would be great to then integrate it into that so that you could have like a one-off kind of install. And they were using, I believe, CRDs to do it. So it's not in like Kubernetes core. It's like a separate project.
Okay. And then have you guys talked at all about like the end-to-end testing and certification? Like, if someone has a Kubernetes cluster that's configured with these policy objects for multi-tenancy, a lot of the end-to-end test suite doesn't work. Have you thought about like defining like a test profile for this model?
Yeah, so I think a part of our mandate or charter or whatever was eventually doing the whole E2E thing to verify that your cluster is like at least getting the security kind of boundaries that you expect, which is going to be different per kind of model. But yeah, it does obviously, like if you turn off, running privileged containers or something, you're breaking that test suite that shows that it's a like verified Kubernetes cluster. And like, I know that we've hit weird things like that internally too with things. So I think we're going to need to modify whatever those definitions are and make them like more in tune with how people are actually going to set these up. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem with distributors actually distributing kind of more secure clusters that are not, that like aren't official.
Yeah. I'm curious if anyone from the OpenShift team is on the call and how those folks think about OpenShift with respect to this, because you guys have, or OpenShift has a lot of the sort of project isolation. And so from a certification standpoint, I'm curious how we think about that.
Hey, yeah. I am just being a fly on the wall right now, gathering information. I don't have a good answer for you right now, but next meeting I will.
Okay.
Sorry, thanks.
No, it's okay. As I we're showing up for the first time, so we're just trying to.
Me too.
Just a quick comment about the testing, for multi-tenancy. So there's been a discussion going on in a conformance working group about creating a separate profile for multi-tenancy. It's kind of very initial stage. There were a few discussions around that, but I think that's something has been kicked around as well. So essentially, set up profiles. They kind of go on top of the baseline conformance, the certification thing actually. So that's been talked about, but nothing has been done yet.
Okay. Do you think that's a thing that you would want to drive out of this working group or out of the testing?
Well, I guess I think they're going to work together, I guess, when that happens. So right now there's no profile as yet. So right now there's only one certification at the baseline level, you see. And the goal is to have, these profiles, multi-tenancy profile or something else, profiles, different profiles. And then the service provider can do certification for those profiles, basically.
Hi. So just to add on to what Deepak was saying, the main problem right now is we don't have enough tests in the base test suite. Once we have tests in the base test suite, then we can do profiles. So there's a bootstrapping problem already. So if this group can suggest additional tests that we can develop and add to the base test suite, then we can talk about how to make them into profiles. Does that help, Jared?
Yeah, I think so.
So another question I asked on the chat was, are you talking about some existing tests that don't really work when you turn these things on?
Yeah, so to Jesse's point earlier, things like a privileged container, right? So if your pod security profile in the multi-tenancy mode disables privileged containers, then your Kubernetes solution basically fails the anti-test suite.
There are two tests that fail because of that. Yeah.
But that's sort of that's just one example. I think there are others, and so I guess as we've been thinking about this, I guess the thing we're not sure how to handle is that if you're building a product that is a sort of intended to be a multi-tenant Kubernetes environment, but then you have to kind of turn off all of the tenant isolation and security controls in order to certify the platform. It seems kind of problematic.
Yeah, I can point you to issues that I created like about a year ago about this. But the net here is we need to list exactly which tests fail under which condition, under which security knob. So we need to document this. And then that is something I can take to SIG architecture and the conformance working group and tell them for additional information to justify that we need a profile for multi-tenancy.
I think this is something that also you could drive out of the specification that we talked about. So if you come up with a list of assertions where you say, okay, this is how we define soft multi-tenancy. These are the policies, this is the runtime isolation, here's what we think you should and shouldn't be able to do. If there was something that you could refer to that had a list of assertions, you could then turn those assertions into a test suite or additional tests.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess I'm hearing like folks feel like it would be a welcome effort to try to write down that use case to sort of elaborate on the specific multi-tenancy scenario we're talking about, and then try to get to a more sort of formal specification of a policy object configuration that would support that model.
I would recommend starting from both ends. Document what is breaking when you turn things on. So that's the short term, go bang on people's doors to say, okay, this is not working for us, kind of thing. And on the other side, which is the longer term thing, like everybody here is suggesting doing the specification and coming from the other side. So one other question that I had was around, have you thought about how to tie like namespaces to specific nodes and do multi-tenancy that way? Because that is something that we've tried in a couple of places in OpenStack related efforts, where if you define a namespace, then you say that these nodes are only running payloads from tied to that namespace. So that's part of that at all.
Yeah. So we
with a custom scheduler thing.
Yeah. So I won't say that it's a solved problem, but I'm sure you guys have thought about some of these solutions as well. So, there's the model. David did a talk earlier this year, calling out the use of like taints and tolerations as a mechanism for doing that. So you could put a taint on certain nodes that were tied to like a namespace ID and add some toleration on the all pods of the namespace to pin them there. We've also been like internally chatting about the idea of using, some kind of policy configuration on the namespace that would say that would, do something to like either pin like a node affinity value to a pod or something as part of the pod life cycle to pin it to hosts. Ben, I don't know if you want to chime in here on other approaches that we've discussed.
Yeah, sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Ben. I also work at VMware, and I'm looking at this in a very deep technical sense. I think that I think from a business value standpoint, there's two areas of interest to us. I think the namespace isolation from a runtime perspective and achieving that through having individual nodes of a namespace makes a ton of sense. We're also interested in looking at network isolation for namespaces, which is something I know you guys have talked about as well. But from a runtime standpoint, we're also interested in pod level isolation as well. So, that might be obvious that that's something we're interested in, being VMware. But I think, yeah, we're very interested in looking at how we could define policies associated with a particular namespace, for example, where you could say, okay, I want a namespace, it has this much resource. I don't care about strong pod isolation necessarily within this namespace, but I absolutely want strong runtime isolation within the namespace. And therefore, I want my own nodes for this namespace. Or I have a namespace and everything I want to run in this namespace, I want to run as a VM, for example.
So, right. So there are some things that you can already do, and that is something we should definitely document, saying that these are the possibilities right now to achieve the soft multi-tenancy, and then go on to do the rest of the things that this working group has been talking about, I think.
Yeah, to kind of elaborate, I think on what that part of the conversation. You can envision that there's sort of several levels of potential isolation of a namespace. Like one level is, namespaces share workers, and so my pods might be intermingled with pods of other workers on a single Linux host. You could also envision sort of a mode where a namespace had a dedicated set of workers, and the only pods running on those workers were from that namespace. The third model that Ben was suggesting is that, if we look at, models like Kata containers and gvisor, where you potentially have sort of hardware-assisted isolation at the container or pod level. So it might be on a shared worker, but I have a stronger form of separation of the containers and pods than Linux namespaces. As we looked at that, so there's like the runtime config and the pod security policy, where we sort of address this on a per pod basis. As we've been looking at, we've been thinking about how you make this sort of selectable on a namespace level. So in other words, I kind of want to mark a namespace that's a policy on the namespace and covering all of the pods in it. So in other words, rather than trying to say, hey, within a single namespace, I might have some things that are isolated on dedicated workers and other things on shared workers, that becomes really complicated, I think, for the end user to reason about. Whereas like a policy in the namespace that says, this is the level of isolation this namespace should get, and we can sort of automate the policy application to individual pods, seems like a model that's, balances isolation with usability.
For what it's worth, Project Zero just found like 3 different bugs in gvisor, so.
Interesting. So I feel like some of this might be getting a little far ahead on the skis. I feel like we got consensus on the idea of like documenting the use case and documenting the policy configuration, documenting some of the end-to-end tests that be impacted by that policy configuration. Is that like a reasonable next milestone?
Yeah, I think that's great. And actually, like building that into, I put it in the notes in the agenda, but the security profiles that they have, like if there's a way to write one of those for this configuration, then every other company that wants this will be able to deploy it easily and like have the peace of mind that their cluster is okay.
Yeah.
The only other information I have is there is a runtime class kept in progress. Have you already seen that?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, I think when it comes to runtime class, I think it's a much cleaner convention to be able to associate a runtime class with a namespace than associate it with individual pods potentially. So again, that's something that would be interesting to explore.
Yeah, definitely. You need to talk to Tim Allclair about that. Yeah. Well, when I was in Signode, when we were talking about runtime class initially, one of my concerns was that it could make pod specs unportable because you tie a pod spec to a particular runtime. Then you depend on the cluster having that runtime available. So,
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, certainly. Yes, for the VMware team, my name is Charles Dushek. I'm working on a decentralized cloud system. And is there, whenever y'all are looking at this, is there an alternative solution to provide multi-tenancy, possibly by running different instances of the runtime on the same end equipment, achieving the same goal?
Can you elaborate on that? Do you mean like having both like a containerd and a gvisor runtime like on the same host?
Having 2 separate instances of the Kubernetes runtime, essentially trying to achieve the same goal on the node, but from more of a instance of the runtime versus trying to make multi-tenancy actually inside the single Kubernetes instance of the runtime.
So when you say the runtime, sorry, like are you referring to like the kubelet and everything associated with it? It's like having multiple kubelets on a host?
Yeah, I guess I'm not completely familiar with the whole Kubernetes thing, but I'm just trying to think of alternative solutions that achieve the same goal on the same machine. If I ran multiple instances of the runtime with different, that are connected to different Kubernetes clusters, then I essentially have multi-tenancy on my machine, but it's not in the same fashion of me coming down from a single Kubernetes instance.
So in other words, a single host having multiple kubelets that are paired with different API masters?
Yes, that's probably what I'm referring to.
Yeah, so the problem there is some of the things, accounting goes haywire, CPU, memory, disk, and stuff like that. The kubelet kind of assumes, I think, that it is in charge of the node. So if you run other things, then it's going to become a problem with the scheduler or something like that, I think.
There was a suggestion during the runtime class debate as to whether a single kubelet should be able to support multiple runtime classes on a single node. And I think that would be what closest to what you're referring to, because you know, the kubelet's designed to be, as you point out, you know, a single node agent. It's very, very tightly coupled to the node. It's very tightly coupled to the pods containers running on the node. If you were to have two different runtime classes available to a kubelet, you'd have to deal with all the resource management challenges that came out of that. You would also have to deal with, you know, I mean, you get bogged down in overheads and all these other things. It becomes complicated. I think they decided against that. It's my understanding. It was something like Kata. You can run Kata containers and you could run regular containers in the same VM if you wanted to. It's just that as it stands, Kubernetes not designed to be able to deal with two different runtimes.
Yeah, I think I was referring to having multiple VMs on the same machine running.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you consider a VM to be you know, a unit of isolation, so a unit of runtime isolation, and a unit of like a single fault domain, then it makes a ton of sense to have to use VMs to draw those lines, right? So, you know, this is why we're talking about, for a namespace, you could say, okay, well, namespace has exclusive access to a certain number of VMs. Or at the pod level, like with Kata containers, you say, okay, well, the pod has exclusive access to a VM and has its own kernel. It just depends on really where you want to draw those lines. But yeah, that would allow you to, in terms of hardware, absolutely, VMs are a very, very useful construct in allowing you to draw those hard security boundaries.
Okay, I appreciate the input. Thank you.
The question about the VMware folks, actually, this is regarding, there was a lot of discussion, I think a couple of months ago, about namespace not being the right level of abstraction for multi-tenancy. So there was a discussion around tenant, maybe a new tenant kind of a concept that may include multiple namespaces. You know, did you guys think on those lines? Or are you pretty much looking at namespace being the solution for enabling multi-tenancy?
Yeah, we agreed with what the CoreOS team was saying about namespace being related to an application. I think that this would be sort of in agreement with that.
So you think there's a need for a higher level construct such as first class tenant object? Is that something you folks are leaning towards as well?
I think we're like kind of been debating that. So, you know, there's what we've seen as a model is that in certain cases we don't need like an explicit tenant construct, that really becomes more a function of the identity management system. So, you know, I think for example, there's a model where, like, as a user, when we have like a login command, and when I log in, the system sort of generates a kube config file for me based on the set of namespaces that I have access to. And, you know, that could, you know, manifest itself like even in a multi-cluster environment where I have basically like a context for each namespace, where the context fully specifies the namespace name and API master of that. And so in that model, you can kind of have this sort of more loosely coupled model where a user has a role binding on one or more namespaces. And there's a system that sort of manages their kube config based on knowledge of those role bindings. And then the organization concept can almost live entirely in the authentication endpoint. That's basically in its response to your login commands, like telling you which namespaces you have access to. So in that model, I don't think that requires like an explicit notion of a tenant. It's really just like a peer-to-peer relationship between users and namespaces. There are certain cases where explicitly having like a tenant object seems useful. In the case of like an enterprise having multiple teams share a cluster, I think so far we haven't necessarily come across a strong need for that yet.
Yeah, because I don't remember. I think it's been a while, and I need to go through the document as well, because I think the consensus was that using namespace as an abstraction for multi-tenancy was kind of force-feeding, because that was not the purpose of namespace, it seems. You see. And that's why there was a big discussion around the hierarchy, I mean, the two-level hierarchy, tenant being at the top and then multiple namespaces underneath it. So I need to kind of go back as well. It's been a while, actually. So there was I think there are a lot of documents. I think David put together a lot of discussion, and I captured all that discussion in the document as well. So I need to go back as well.
Yeah, we were sort of rewatching the recording of the last meeting of this group from July or something, and there was a discussion that you guys had about this. And part of the discussion you guys had, which I think we agree with, is that the namespace really maps more to an application boundary than a business unit boundary. And I guess the question is, in the case of like enterprise level multi-tenancy, is it sufficient to just have that level of distinction that, like, as a user in the enterprise, I have access to these applications, or do I need some higher level construct also?
Yeah, because it can get pretty complex as well. Because I used to work at Siebel, Oracle, and all that, and we used to build that as part of our ERPs and CRMs. So you can have a potentially tenant hierarchy as well. So essentially, you assign your quota at the higher level, and then that kind of gets divvied up across all the sub-organization and all that. So it can get pretty complex as well, actually, if you start doing that.
So, I think from our, obviously in vSphere, we have a lot of experience like helping customers build like internal cloud platforms. And, I think we've been seeing, that full hierarchy where like I give like a business unit a quota, and then each of the projects have quotas that like take up from that. We see a lot of people moving away from that model towards a more flat model, where the sort of discussion that goes on is more along the lines of like, hey, this namespace is our the mobile backend for our mobile, and this namespace needs this much resources, and so we're just trying to provide guarantees or limits to the individual application level. And whether that like exceeds the quota of the BU, that's more like a chargeback issue, that they're not trying to put a quota on the BU. They're more trying to like release the restrictions and, focus more on reporting back to each business unit, how many namespaces and how much resources those namespaces are consuming.
Well, that's a valid point. I mean, that's what the discussion was all about. Maybe the hierarchy which I talked about is more of a role hierarchy, you see, which has to do with the authentication or authorization and all that. So how do you tie that up? But I think there was a consensus to some extent that we need to have at least two level of hierarchy, tenant being at the top and then multiple namespaces. So it's been a while. So I think that's what kind of people agreed on that, but then it kind of, I don't know anything happened after that.
Well, if we think about it from an approach of a lot of Kubernetes seems to be to provide sort of building blocks that allow you to build up through policy, the version that you want at your business. And so I could see and it would be great if there was a model where if you wanted that level of hierarchy, you had the option of turning on that capability. But if you didn't want it, you didn't have to use it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think, like I said, I think a lot of it comes down to like really defining the use case. Certainly like when you get into, we talk about like Coke versus Pepsi multi-tenancy, they're like having
so I think that's what needs to happen. I think to Dim's point, I think this is what this group can really add value. Essentially, be able to define various flavors of multi-tenancy, and then accordingly you can have different profiles. So hard multi-tenancy, hard multi-tenancy, soft multi-tenancy, and then correspondingly you have those kind of related profiles basically. See, and that's what has to be done by this group, because this group understands what multi-tenancy is. And that information can be fed into the conformance / the SIG architecture folks so that they can build profiles out of it.
I think one of the interesting things, though, when you get into the hard multi-tenancy discussion, I read Jesse's document about hard multi-tenancy, suggesting you have, individual API servers, individual DNS servers per namespace. Once you get into that realm, it becomes a much, much bigger thing than just profiles, and it also becomes very difficult to reason about and test for. If you have any kind of end-to-end test, the question of whether the API server you're talking to is an individual one for your namespace or whether it's a global one is something that's going to be very, very hard to test. So I think this is why starting at the softer end of the scale is something that's going to be a lot easier for us to reason about.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like I would love to see us sort of get to, a single, probably the MVP multi-tenancy model of like, without going too far ahead of where Kubernetes is now. I feel like there's a version of multi-tenancy that can be supported with the policy objects that exist in the current implementation. And, sort of defining that as a good stepping stone. From there, we can talk about, additional profiles that enhance that capability with new, stronger forms of isolation and, support different models of multi-tenancy.
Right. I would also encourage us to think about primitives like taints and tolerations, something else similar to that, which can be used to then build the multi-tenancy stuff. Even if the tenant concept itself lives outside of Kubernetes, if we have those primitives, then we can apply those in different ways, right? Essentially. So I would want us to think about those kinds of things as well, like smaller things that can be easily added to Kubernetes without too much fuss, and which everybody can use. It's easier to get a smaller thing into Kubernetes than to get a bigger thing into Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Especially into the core, as you all probably know.
So the next meeting, I'll again, I'm Sally I work on OpenShift. I'll be more prepared to talk, but I'd love to talk about OpenShift, how we use the project. We have the project added to the OpenShift API, and we use a combination of things with RBAC and to result in multi-tenancy. So I'd love to lay that all out for you next meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think one quick thing from Huawei, actually, we have multi-tenancy actually enabled as part of our Kubernetes cloud offering. And one of the work which we are doing is we kind of documenting how did we harden all that thing. I think that kind of fits into the security profile. So would like to kind of share that as well with the community. Maybe that would be helpful. So maybe we can, one of these meetings, I can bring in the person who's done that work, and then he can share his experiences. How did we harden the various objects and all these namespaces and all that in order to enable the multi-tenancy?
Yeah, we would love to do the same.
Yes, yeah, sure, definitely.
So, well, that would be an awesome discussion, I think, to have 3 different teams that sort of independently arrived at a multi-tenancy solution to sort of swap notes and perhaps that standard profile comes out of some unification of those 3 approaches. Or perhaps there's 3 different profiles, depending on how same or different we've approached it.
Yeah, with multi-tenancy, it can be like, bring your own multi-tenancy to Kubernetes. It doesn't have to be something baked into Kubernetes. It works well outside of 2.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd also like to see the different use cases that those are targeted towards, if y'all built them for specific clients, if possible.
Okay, so when is the next call? This call's every 2 weeks?
Yeah, it's every other week. If we have a lot of things that like you all want to do, we could make it more like kind of every week, but we do it on the off weeks of SIGAUTH.
Okay.
Hey, I can tell you something cool that we have going on. So our CI for OpenShift is run in an OpenShift cluster, and so every like we have, various repositories, and every PR job gets run in a pod in a separate namespace in an OpenShift cluster. And as a PR author, you have access to that. It's a project namespace, and you have access to that, but nobody else does. It's pretty cool. So when you have a PR test running, you can go in and follow the pod logs and figure out what's going on. That was just recently added, the RBAC necessary for like the PR author to have access to that stuff. So yeah, our CI system is pretty cool. We run Prow. Yeah.
That's really neat.
Yeah.
I think that's all we have to say, right?
Good action items and next steps. Are there other topics folks want to discuss, or if not, perhaps we could adjourn the call, and I look forward to getting back and discussing some of these things.
Totally. I love open source. You can just like join stuff. It's awesome. It's really nice to meet you guys. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, same. So Jared, at least the minimum action item is please ping me with a list of the PR, the issues that you've seen with different toggles.
Yeah, yeah. So I think let's go. We'll sort of document both the the particular configuration we're working with, and then we could probably. I mean, do you want like a whole like Sonobuoy report on?
Whatever you can. Just open Kubernetes issues, and I'll watch them.
Okay.
And we can talk about it on the issues.
So I just got a question for you guys who've come along fairly recently. I still get the feeling like that we haven't really locked down what our definitions of a tenant is. Is that going to sort of be in the way for some of the things that we were just talking about doing?
I think that the reality is that there are many definitions of a tenant, and there are probably multiple answers to that question. As I think about the task we discussed of like trying to document like this model of enterprise multi-tenancy, which we admit is just one model and not all of them, I feel like we should start documenting those things more concretely. And I suspect we end up with actually like 2 or 3 or 4 different things there. Or maybe we can converge them into a single definition. But otherwise, it's sort of like, it's either like a philosophical debate of like, what is existence, or else we're trying to like merge, 3 kind of very different entities that we all happen to place the same name on.
And it's not going to work for anybody else.
Well, so it feels kind of like we should maybe go bottom up and figure out what are the primitives that apply to all the different definitions of tenants. Is that an approach?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking, that we start kind of bottom up, that there's a thing, I'm hesitant to even call it a tenant, but there's a form of like namespace isolation that's useful for multiple engineering teams sharing a cluster, but want sort of more lockdown access to their workloads versus other people's workloads.
I don't know if you saw my document. So our use cases is, I think, a bit more convoluted than other people's, in which namespaces actually can be, you can have multiple tenants granting other people access to stuff in the namespace, particularly in a dev and test environment. So the primitive approaches, there's none of the other kind of tenant per namespace or one-to-many between a tenant and namespaces kind of captures our use cases, particularly because we'll have people tenants sharing namespaces even in some cases. So, yeah. So I think that was one of the last documents that was discussed.
Yeah, I know, personally speaking, like I don't think I could rattle off a definition of tenant that would work for every scenario.
Yeah, I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
Is there some level of definition along security lines, or how hard like levels of hardness that could be used to define various types of tenants?
You know, I like another approach I think feel like would be to sort of take a persona and user experience based approach. So, you know, if you start off with like a definition of personas where like, hey, like I've got a cluster administrator and then I've got a bunch of engineering teams and you can sort of document those personas and document sort of the key workflows and user experience that each of those personas have of how they use the cluster. So for example, like as a developer accessing a shared Kubernetes cluster, I have a kind of weird level of access. Like if I go read the Kubernetes documentation and go through the tutorials of like how to use Kubernetes, you know, a lot of those things might not work, right? Like in the sort of namespace level tenancy, you know, I'm probably not using the default namespace. I'm always using a specific namespace. And I can create namespaces potentially, but I can't necessarily, you know, see inside namespaces that other teams have created. I also probably am limited to namespace scoped objects. And so I might be able to, maybe I can see cluster scoped objects, or maybe I can't even see them at all. And so, you know, I feel like there's a useful task in documenting those personas and user experiences. And there's probably a couple different scenarios. Like you could envision hey, I've got a shared cluster and a cluster admin and a set of engineering teams. Then you could envision like, hey, I'm, you know, Google Cloud and I've got like 10 different accounts that all have, you know, they're all sharing some cluster, but have some kind of privileged access to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that makes sense.
Cool. So we can kick off documenting the use case that we've been looking at. And then, you know, I think probably 2 weeks is a good cadence still, Jess, if we want to get back together and have the different people who volunteered kind of go over how they've been locking down their clusters and kind of what their use cases are. And then we can kind of look at the proposal for the soft multi-tenancy within an enterprise and kind of just see how everyone's feeling about that and kind of take it from there. Does that make sense?
Cool, yeah, sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we can have there's been so much good work done on like how you might do all these different things. And I think that if we were to have a kind of an opinionated suggestion that said for each of these different areas, like resource isolation, network isolation, control plane isolation, all these different things, if we had an opinionated document that says, you know, here's what soft multi-tenancy would look like in this suggestion, here's how you might choose to configure it, here's where we would come down on these different topics, and that would be a great jumping off point for further debate.
Sweet. So does anyone have anything else to add for today? Otherwise we can give you back like 15 minutes.
Yeah, I just had one question as far as the goal of the multi-tenancy. Is it to entirely isolate each of the, I guess, namespaces or whatever we use to accomplish the multi-tenancy? What is the overarching goal?
So like as a working group, we have a few goals, but it really depends on the model of multi-tenancy that you're kind of going after. And all those documents are actually linked from the agenda doc for this working group as well.
Okay, thank you, Jesse.
Okay then, see you all in 2 weeks.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Welcome.